Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are tuning in from and whatever time it is. It's nice to see your smiling faces. I hope you're doing all right amidst this time. I'm going through a backlog of a bunch of different edits here, and we have a fantastic, again, reaction video. The first one we did was with Skinner. It was a fantastic APA address, one of his final public addresses right before he passed away. If you haven't listened to that one's out there. This is a similar format of us listening, reacting, sharing our thoughts. Today, Murray Sidman, one of my behavioral heroes. All right, let's jump into it.
You want the honors?
Yes.
All right.
Welcome to this episode of The Controversial Exchange. I think I'm going to start calling it The Controversial Exchange, much like The Ohio State University.
Nice, all right.
Yeah, I think The Controversial Exchange, where we will be reviewing today for you. We really appreciate all the kind words everyone had about our previous review. We're going to be reviewing Murray Sidman on The Scientist, Practitioner, and Behavior Analysis, a Case Study, SQAB Talk. For those of you curious, SQAB is the Society for Quantitative Analysis of Behavior. Is that correct? No.
Yes.
Like Society of Quantitative Analysis of Behavior.
Yeah. The nerdiest of nerdy communities that are out there is definitely SQAB.
They are, yes.
Think about, you're in your grad program, you learn about the matching law, but then the matching law consumes your life for the rest of your life, and you just take that as far as you can. And that's this community. And I bring that up jokingly, but also with a lot of respect of just a fantastic realm of behavior analysis that's actually doing some pretty cool stuff that I don't even necessarily understand because my mathematics are lacking.
Well, I mean, just to be clear, I think that any claim that we have is applied. If you're an applied practitioner out there, or even an applied researcher, any claim that you have to justify what you're doing is hard science, you can thank the SQAB folks for that, because these guys, these folks take what we do and they actually put it through. They're looking for models and first principles, and that's what the basis of what they do is. So without them, we would not have the mathematical representations of behavior in the way that we understand them, like matching law, like behavioral momentum theory, even in the realm of cognition. So like stimulus control, like all these different things that just even base ideas, like, is reinforcement even real, right? I mean, for real. And then them being able to demonstrate these response patterns and what they look like, and then being able to create algorithms that project out the response patterns, like what's the one called the Rescorla-Wagner model, which is the gold standard currently. So again, there's a lot of like understanding who SQAB is, understanding the role they play in EAB. Shout out Dr. Califit, even though I'm mad as hell at you right now, but for exposing me to a lot of these things. But anyway, so yeah, these are the folks that make this shit science.
Their society formed decades ago. They are now formally like a part and around. They're a separate entity, but they're around the ABAI, the Association of Behavior Analysis International's annual conference every year, which has always historically been around Memorial Day weekend. They go for the couple days prior to the start of ABI. So if anyone's looking to really jump in this community, there's essentially a pre-convention convention of that large one, and they've just always piggybacked off of that. Because it is a small, strong, but small representatively community, and it just didn't make sense for them to have another event outside of the main mothership giant event of the year. And so that's where you go learn about this sort of stuff. I've yet to actually be to one, but I found their YouTube channel and things. They used to hold these on like iTunes University is where I first found these.
That's amazing. They have a robust amount of lectures available for free on the internet. And the SQAB talks are unbelievable. I mean, in all fairness, like these, again, when we say these people are nerds, like, I mean, they're real scientists. So sometimes they don't quite have the colorful presentation style, and they use a lot of technical terminology, and EAB language is different than conventional behavior analytic language in that it is very much stimulus response oriented speech. So people are going to talk in terms of that conditioned stimulus, USCS,
But before you click out,
type thing.
Murray Sidman's talk is not like that.
No. The Murray Sidman stuff is not like that. So please don't go away. You're going to love this. But anyway, a couple things about Murray Sidman. Well, I guess, you know what? Let's just let the guy introduce Murray Sidman, and then we'll talk.
Okay.
Let's just get rolling.
If there's anything we need to add, we will.
Yeah, this is a long video, so we have plenty of time.
One of my intellectual heroes.
Oh, master.
Already know. A lot of you know Murray personally. Either you've been lucky enough to work with him and study with him like I have, or maybe you met him on a trip to Boston, where you probably enjoyed the hospitality for which the Sidmans are very well known. Or maybe you met him in the course of his travels, which have been extensive, across the States and Europe and the Far East, and especially to Brazil, where, as Julio de Rose told us a couple of years ago at this conference, he was initially known in the town of San Carlos as that nice fellow that accompanies Rita Sidman on her trips to Brazil. If you don't know Murray personally, you most probably know of him through his work. Depending upon how much gray you have in your hair, you might think first of the work on unsignaled avoidance or the work on stimulus equivalence, two research areas that will always be associated with his name. It was the equivalence research that prompted Bill McIlvaine at this conference about 6 years ago to remark that Murray was certainly in a class by himself.
So there's two tomes just to add to this that I think are absolute must reads if you're interested in stimulus equivalence, and which is, in my opinion, the math of RFT, which is Murray Sidman's Equivalence, Relations, and Behavior, a Research Story. There you go.
This is how nerdy we are. We both just grabbed it and showed the camera at the same time.
That's great, dude. And then also Tactics of Scientific Research, Evaluating Experimental Data in Psychology, Murray Sidman.
I'm going to up you on this one, though.
Uh-oh.
I got 2 copies.
Oh, that's fine. You can have to. That's fine.
No, dude, it was always so good. It's always so good. I actually keep an extra in case I find somebody or I'm working with somebody like a kind of mentorship sort of model.
Yeah, of course.
Like, you haven't read this, here's your copy.
Yeah, no, it was recommended to me by a professor, and dude, honest to God, like it definitely has helped me understand a lot more than I thought about
it was
basic
the
stuff.
research book that research books were written off of. I think it's the best way I've heard it described.
That's smart. That's a good way to put
my
it.
boy Mark Malady that we talked about now and then recommended it to me. He was actually completely amazed that I hadn't read it before getting into grad school, and he's like, "You can read this summer."
Yeah, dude, it's a must read if you're interested in consuming research. Murray Sidman is just prolific.
What's cool is it works. It really works for like any fields research. Yeah. You're trying to understand how to understand what claims they made and whether or not their research actually evaluated those claims or not.
Yeah.
So
prolific.
Cool. Agreed, man. Sweet.
And there are a large number of other areas where you may have contacted his work. To name just a few, there's aphasia, there's analysis of stimulus generalization, there is conditional discrimination analyses, errorless learning, stimulus control, topography shaping. And his topic for today, which is one that might be a little bit less familiar to you, which is applied research with people who have mental retardation. And this is an area where Murray...
Again, this is an older thing, so it's important to preface that I'm not 1998. So
that was still the acceptable diagnostic
term.
Criteria and term that was used.
No one's using it as a pejorative, just so that we're clear.
And his team from the Mass General Hospital are truly among the pioneers. But even if you haven't read anything by Murray Sidman yet, if you've read anything at all that's been published in JAV or JAVA, then you've made indirect contact with the influence of his book, Tactics of Science, published in 1960, something that's done a lot to influence the way the science of the analysis of behavior is done. So I think that covers everybody here. If I'm wrong, and maybe you've wandered in on your way to the Magic Kingdom, my advice is to stick around and to join us in welcoming our friend and our teacher, Murray Sidman.
What a compliment to be referred to as a teacher by, when older people are like, when this guy's like obviously probably a pretty accomplished dude, when someone refers to somebody as a teacher, like sensei, you know what I'm saying? He is definitely a kung fu master.
Thank you. Thank you all for your greeting. I want to thank Bill Paglia for arranging everything so nicely. And of course I want to thank Bill Doobie for that wonderful introduction. Of course he's an old friend. He's prejudiced. But someday there are some very good things to be said about him too, and maybe someday I'll have the opportunity to introduce him. It's an honor and a privilege to be given an opportunity to speak to this particular group. I see many of my old friends here, and it's nice to see friendly faces in front, especially. I'm many also whom I hope will become new friends. Most of you actually will be hearing nothing new from me today. Indeed, many of you have similar stories to tell. I hope, though, that you'll still find my story interesting and my concerns worth attending to. I'm going to say a few things today about some work my colleagues and I did from 1965 to 1975 in an institution for people who are characterized as mentally retarded. One could easily argue that most of what we learned in those early days has since become standard practice. But I have two main reasons for dredging up this old material now. First, it's become evident to me that except for some superficial features, a number of the so-called standard practices are rarely practiced. By describing some of what we learned in what must seem to some of you like the beginning of time, I hope that those of you who are always seeking more effective behavior change techniques from our experiences. My second reason for taking a new look at things we did many years ago is a tension that I see developing between experimental and applied behavior analysts. I hear some claiming that the experimental analysis of behavior should not be contaminated by applied interests. From the other direction, I hear that the experimental analysis of behavior no longer has relevance to applied behavior analysis. Well, I'm not just concerned.
Do you hear that?
Yeah.
Do you hear that people say that?
Yeah, the divide, man.
What about the idea that EAB, animal research, basic research isn't really like applicable to applied research anymore?
Well, yeah, so I'm saying like we hear that nowadays, and it's, I mean, when was this? You said
This was 98, and he's going to be referring to projects they did in 65 to 75.
Yeah.
And as a result of encountering this problem back then.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that as soon as you formed the branch of applied behavior analysis and you started working in that realm, like you essentially started creating that air quote divide. It's really, I think it's partially that they're working in isolation in chambers, sometimes away from each other, but it's also up to the practitioner to read both sides and be able to start making those links as well, which I think is what most people are complaining about nowadays. Don't necessarily read both sides of the arguments.
Ooh,
right?
You know what? I want to revisit that.
Okay.
Because I want to see what he has to say, but I don't know if I agree with that statement in its entirety anymore. And this is as a result of taking some EAB now.
And that adherence to one of these points of view will destroy the other, but that they will each destroy themselves. I'm quite convinced, first of all, that the applied analysis of behavior will stagnate and die unless it continues to draw contributions from the experimental science. Second, I'm equally convinced that the experimental science of behavior will not survive by itself. It needs an effective, allied, applied science. A third group, made up of individuals who are both scientists and practitioners, is essential. The scientist-practitioner tradition is the key. If we are to expect the public to continue to support behavioral science, then as scientists, we must translate our principles into practice. And as practitioners, we must become scientists in our evaluation of procedures and outcomes. Behavior analysts have to accept these responsibilities if we are to convince others that it is in their best interests to support us. And by support, I refer not just to research funds, but also to financial support for clients, that is to say, for those who could benefit from the practice of our science. And I refer to political support for the passage of laws that require effective practices. If we do not collaborate in generating such support, the world is not going to let us continue with either our science or our practice. Now, I'm not going to elaborate these points or cite evidence. Instead, I'm going to tell a little story about how a group of laboratory investigators learned a long time ago that they possessed an almost unbelievably effective set of applied behavioral tools. A set of tools that work both in principle and in actuality. In telling this story, I hope to convey a sense of the obligation we assume by investigating, teaching, and practicing the powerful technology that B.F. Skinner laid the foundations for. Let me give just a little background. The building in which we began our work housed 72 boys ranging in age from 6 to 20 years, most of them between 10 and 15 years. On first entering the building in January 1965, we found the boys just lying or sitting around, most of them unclothed and unwashed.
I mean, they're referring to he's referring to what institutions looked like in the 60s.
Yeah.
And
have you ever worked in those institutions?
Have I worked? Never in an institution, no. I can't say that I have. I've worked in severe behavior units, and I've been around in the periphery, and I've visited them, and I've worked with clients who have gone to them, but I've never personally worked in one.
I was only ever a part of like a consultation team that went in to help them for these quick, rapid consults. So you came in on a Sunday, you left on a Friday. Monday morning at like 5 o'clock in the morning is when you figured out who needed help with functional approaches to solving problem behavior. And you had 5 days to figure that out before you left, including a full-on, analysis, treatment, training, out the door. It was insane. 1,500 bed facility, descriptive of like the population range. He's talking about the full on image of like overworked staff, people not happy with the line of work, or like just poor wages. A lot of kind, compassionate, caring people trying to make that better, but just always fighting an uphill battle everywhere you go. This place had its own church, dining areas, had its own fishing hole. Like it was a completely gated, closed out community for 1,500 people to live in. It was unreal what that looked like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're describing what the nicer version of it looks like 50 years later, 40 years later.
Yeah, and to be clear, it was the state of Texas was being sued by the federal government for $1 million a day until they cleaned up their act because of the poor performance of it. And this was much later than after the deinstitutionalization movement started, obviously, is why that was happening. But, dude, if you haven't worked in those settings, learning about them and what practitioners at that time were.
Yeah. I mean, dude, it
was researchers were transitioning into this and like creating that practitioner framework.
Yeah. This is where, that's how they got into the institutions. I mean, this is because the conditions were so bad, so inhumane, so unbelievably horrifying that it was what they would call in academia low-hanging fruit. Not that these people are low-hanging fruit, but the idea that it would be like any improvement would be vastly better than what's going on. So they saw it as an opportunity to go in and see how they could take the technology and really change people's lives for the better. And if they could change these people's lives, maybe they could change everybody's.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's keep going.
There were no teachers, just caretakers called attendants, who were able to do little more than to see that the boys did not seriously harm themselves or each other. The boys swarmed all over us, picking at our clothing, fingers, faces, and pockets, pushing, pulling, pinching, scratching, sometimes biting, uttering incomprehensible noises, and in general, frightening us all. At meals, many took food from each other, dumped food on each other on the floor, and required continuous supervision. Some had learned to feed themselves with a spoon, but most still ate with their hands or had to be fed. A few could dress themselves, but the attendants found that they could devote more time to housekeeping if they dressed the boys, or just as often left them sitting or standing around the room naked. Well, here we were, a group of laboratory people, scientists, technicians, and students, stepping into behavioral chaos. We had no applied behavior analysis texts to guide us. Ion and Azrin had published an account of their token economy at Anna State Hospital, and I was inspired by a visit to Girardeau and Spradlin's token economy in the Institute for the Retarded at Parsons, Kansas.
Could you imagine a world where you're like a research scientist and all of a sudden now you're going to do shit with real people? Compare, what is that person's mindset compared to the person today's mindset who has, you know, Cooper, Heward, and Heron, and they have every other publication on the planet, plus podcasts, plus continuing ed, plus a board of behavior analysis that regulates and provides a basic framework to operate from, and such a robust applied side literature base to draw from. Like,
these folks had so little of what I'm used to. Yeah. Like, I cannot even comprehend it. Like, exactly. Dude, I have a hard time remembering what like dial-up and pre-internet was.
Oh, you don't remember what that feels like?
I mean, I do, but like, dude, it's 20 years removed now. Like, do I really understand that?
Oh,
you know,
man.
Even if I have a slow internet connection in the middle of nowhere, like, dude, that's...
Yeah, you weren't like, see, I was probably like, when you were using the internet, like I was in high school when like we would sit there and download a song for 25, 30, 40 minutes, an hour. And like we'd play the song over and over again because all we were getting was like seconds at a time of it.
Dude, I did the same thing. I mean, I was about 10 or 11, I think, when I really started getting into those sort of things. So I can remember it, but dude,
I mean,
like,
we didn't get internet till I was a sophomore in high school.
One of the things sometimes that people hit me up for is I just know lots of resources and like where to start looking for things in the field.
Yeah.
And that's just simply because the internet afforded those opportunities to start learning about those sort of things. Like, I know how to play around with keywords to find what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
These guys had none of like the modern tools that I'm used to whatsoever, man. I mean, he was talking about, he's like, we had a couple textbooks that were written.
Dude, and here's the thing
that didn't really apply to where we were going, but they were nice.
And here's the fun thing. Like, I would like to challenge, listen. Okay. How about this first new segment? Listener challenge. Go back and check out the original EAB Azrin publications. And I'll tell you what, if you can read them in one sitting, understand everything it says, not fall asleep or contemplate killing yourself, and actually get something useful out of it, I'll give you a digital high five over the internet. I don't know. We'll have to figure out something to give that person. But like, they not barely informative is not the word, especially, or at least unsophisticated in comparison to what we have today. Now it's revolutionary work for its time, right? But it's like going back and listening to old Lenny Bruce albums, or like watching, silent film. Like, at the time it was amazing, but when you look back on it today, you're like, what the fuck is this? So I mean, like, this is what they were working with. These guys were working with the equivalent of the Charlie Chaplin outcomes of fucking behavior analysis.
Except for this pioneering work and a few other exciting reports, our guidance came from the behavioral principles that we had seen in action with non-humans and humans in highly automated, well-controlled laboratories. I'll talk here about only the first few months of our project, January through May, when we learned the most. Our first efforts were devoted to gaining experience ourselves as we attempted to apply principles we had learned in the laboratory. We therefore held frequent conferences at which each of our staff talked about his or her daily activities on the project. These conferences, recorded and transcribed, depict the general methodology we followed, our problems, and some of the solutions we developed. Excerpts from the conferences will illustrate quite concretely what we found we had to learn. You'll soon realize that much of my story is less about the boys than about ourselves. The transformation from scientist to scientist practitioner opened up a new world of reinforcers for our own behavior. One of our first surprises was the discovery that many of the boys were capable of doing more than they usually did. Much of our initial effort was directed at bringing out behavior they already had, but which they had had no reason to engage in. We found that we could accomplish much by simply applying basic contingencies. For example, as soon as we stopped accepting the boys' noises, gestures, and other body language, and started instead to reinforce them for speaking, we found verbal behavior emerging.
Dude, I mean,
if you're watching this and not listening, we have a projector with like printed slides on transparencies being shown right now. It is beautiful. And I just wanted to point out to anyone that hasn't noticed it yet, maybe, he's reading from a paper. Originally, presentations were at events like this were almost primarily used for presenting your idea before it went to publication.
Yeah.
Right? Now, not always, and I don't know if that's where this one ended up, but if you're watching the video of him reading and you're like, you know, he's reading a paper, like that was the cultural practice at that time. And we've kind of gotten away from that in recent events.
I think that...
What were you going to say?
Well, I think that the first thing that they thought about and discovered, which to me is just like amazing, and I think this would be controversial today, I think it is controversial today, is that basically they found that lowering expectations created the conditions of problem behavior and lack of achievement. And despite not treating people like as if they had a disability, but treating them as if they were capable, really changed, number one, how they approached the problem, number two, the outcomes they were seeing in and of themselves. I think we forget a lot of the times that, you know, there is such thing as the soft bigotry of lowered expectations. That's what people refer to it as. And it's a reality for people who work in developmental disabilities, because I mean, so often you get called a saint, blah, blah, blah. Oh, you're such a nice person, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that, like, you're just a person applying a trade just like anybody else out there trying to help people learn, which is what your job is. And your job is to not feel bad for people for where they are and who they are. It's to see them for who they are and what they're capable of, and then programming to those outcomes. And I think it's just unbelievable that just by believing that it was possible was the first step. And in raising the standard and raising the bar of expectation, which produced and created the conditions of particular contingencies that occasioned a better responding. Wow. And on the slide here, it says something that I think is, hopefully he gets more in depth into this, and I'd like to expand on this later, Ryan. So if you can remember this, man, don't mind me to talk about this. Before teaching new behavior, bring out old behavior. Get pupils to do things they already know how to do. And I don't know if we're going to talk about Hanley, My Way, ISCA protocol, anything like that moving forward. But I mean, like, what this statement says to me is that prevent prevents you from winning. And we live in an antecedent manipulation game now, where a lot of people think that if behavior occurs, you failed. When in reality, victory is bringing out the old behavior so you can have an opportunity to contact the extinguishing contingency, so that the alternative is available, prompted, and then reinforced. And that's not a thing. That's not the way the world is constructed today, especially when we're talking about in the realm of education, where it's the PBIS is in PBIS and all that other shit. So, I mean, just a wonderful thing there. Raise your standards is step one in becoming a practitioner scientist, and not just for you, but for your client.
I also thought of it as largely what was going on in these institutions, and when people were moving in, was trying to help with the aversive and punishment-based like procedures that were all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And so in a sense, you got that antecedent side. 100% agree with you on that, Dimitri. But also, like, look at what's going on in the environment. What suppressive contingencies can you remove in addition, so that they can start actually behaving,
thriving.
So many times, dude, that we saw that, you know, oh, nope, you can't do that. You can't do this. Nope, can't go there. Nope, it's not time for that. And if you ask the question why with a lot of the staff, it was something that was rooted. Yeah, it was just for whatever reason, it was inconvenient to the staff member potentially, or it was something that was kind of institutional knowledge of like, oh, we don't do that because whatever, and it wasn't really justified.
Yeah.
Like there was reasons that these suppressive things were in place that were really hard to actually justify from looking at a dignified sort of perspective.
Facts, bro.
Yeah.
It had been there all the time, but had served no useful function.
Oof.
What consequences could we provide that would increase and maintain the behavior that produced them? At that time, we were still able to use M&M candies. Our society had not yet decided that dental development was more important than behavioral development.
I mean, I don't know if I'm with him on the edibles, but I would imagine that walking into the shit show nightmare human rights violation that I'm sure that his eyes and him and his colleagues' eyes saw, M&Ms were a small price to pay. So,
yeah, that was dude, different time. Like the shit that they were dealing with was people dying in hot boxes as a punishment procedure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So sweet. Use it. Use what you got. Being pragmatic means effective above all.
In the laboratory, we had learned to use a simple test. Place a candy in the palm of our hand, show it to the child, close our fist fairly tightly around the candy, and see if the child will try to pull our fingers away to get at the candy. If he or she will do that, even against increasingly tightly held fingers, the candy's obviously a reinforcer.
Hey, pause this for a sec.
And candy,
So with Hanley, the whole ISK approach and things like that, sounds a little bit kind of like the practices of the whole open door analysis and things like that, kind of bleeding back in, you know?
It's weird.
Do you see the similarities between these?
Yeah, it's bizarre how taking a little bit of analysis and putting it into your behavior analysis goes a long way, and that's really what they're talking about here, right? He's describing an open evaluative practice or process to determine the necessary conditions for behavior change, which is what you should do following a certain scientific methodology or sequence. And it's just beautiful. His description's beautiful, and it's like if you should listen to this video, and fuck it. This is our podcast. We can say we can be as biased.
Yeah,
I'm gonna be super biased here. So think Greg Hanley. If you're familiar with Greg Hanley's work, and if you're not, I can't believe that you work in the field and you know what we're talking about right now. You better ask somebody. But seriously.
Yeah, no, for real, yeah.
You better ask
somebody. You better ask somebody.
You better ask somebody.
Like someone just penciled down I need to talk to my supervisor.
Yeah. I need an adult is what you should be saying. But if you don't, this process I think will really highlight the wonderful, great best practices that have been put together, and I'm not getting paid for anything from them or anything like that. There's no profession, whatever. This is just more like a advocacy for good practice and just like listening to Sidman talk. But anyway,
of course, can only be a starter. Eventually, one has to move on to reinforcers that are socially more acceptable and that are more appropriate to the tasks that are being taught.
Oh, weird.
But it's important to recognize that few of those acceptable and appropriate reinforcers are naturally effective.
Ooh.
Just as acts and actions have to be taught, so do reinforcers.
What?
A primary task was to develop conditioned and generalized reinforcers. We began with tokens, plastic poker chips. Later, after the boys had learned to save tokens and to understand numbers, we were able to introduce points. For some, points led eventually to money. As the boys saw how pleased we were when they earned the tokens and points that brought them other reinforcers, our pleasure also became important to them, and we became able to use praise as a reinforcer.
I just want to say one thing here about the conditioning of reinforcers that I think is pretty critical and give people another a great potential reading, is that we talk about conditioning reinforcers in practice, but I don't think that we really teach the process and practice of it from an experimental perspective or even the conceptual nature of it, and also how it's rooted in classical conditioning and stimulus pairing. So for those wondering, classical conditioning is also Pavlovian conditioning. And there's a great discussion going on in the experimental field right now. This is an article from 2016, Damjan, elicited versus emitted behavior, time to abandon the distinction. And this is not the only article on that. I have to say, if you're interested in this more technical side of what we're talking about here, they make an amazing argument for how they're really, when we're talking about operant versus respondent learning, it's kind of a nonsense distinction. It's a distinction without difference. And they're able to demonstrate how that's the case through the process. And a lot of it just has to do with the temporal nature of behavior and the way that the sequences of stimuli and responses occur over time, when in reality it becomes an artificial distinction that we create out there. And really,
they were never separate. We separated the two with our words. We created two constructs, and then we think that they're real.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Dude,
highly recommend that as a reading.
The pairing process that people talk about all the time in practice drives me absolutely insane, because it's thought of, loosely that, oh, I just need to give good shit and everything's going to work out all right.
Yeah, dude.
I'm pairing. It's like, no, like there's a conceptual framework for this.
Yes.
There's actually different procedures, whether you're looking at the applied literature or the experimental literature.
Yes.
And they're rooted in both operant and respondent paradigms. And the probably most important part that people don't realize is the temporal contiguity, and the fact that you place it in a contingency is what matters most. So things where people are just like, oh yeah, I go in there, I'm just kind of pairing, I'm spending time, I'm doing fun activities. Putting in a contingency is one of the most important parts for it to start to actually condition.
Yeah.
So our practice of what almost everybody's doing when it comes to pairing and NCR practices and things like that.
Yeah.
It's not what you're supposed to be doing.
Dude, honest to God,
it's not rooted in the science.
NCR makes my brain hurt anymore. Like,
dude,
now,
it's just,
I hear NCR now and I'm like, so you're saying is you're afraid.
And if
like,
people are listening to us and think we're absolutely fucking crazy, we're not. It's just there's this rapidly growing pressure for people to fill these practitioner roles, and we didn't do a great job as a community of making sure that all the important parts of things the practitioners really need ended up in those training programs. And this is one of those areas that was just missed.
By design, though. I disagree that it was missed. I think that it's by design. I think when you look at the PBIS movement in the 80s that occurred as a result of a lot of the realities that they contacted here in the 60s and 70s, and then you frame that in today's like anti-escape extinction, anti-extinction in general, and then like full tilt NCR type situation where that's the world we want to live in, where we don't have counter controls or like counter contingencies in place, or people just don't contact naturally occurring aversive stimuli, which occur. A stove is a naturally occurring aversive stimulus, right? Not getting engaging in avoidant behavior of crossing the street when cars are coming is it's negative reinforcement. It's a coercive aversive reason that you're doing that. It is, and not balancing, not understanding that there's a yin and a yang to behavior. Like it can't just all be positive all the time. I think is pretty critical, and I think that's been done by design for political and just in general, like to keep people in line, because they do overuse punishment and stuff, or when they're unfettered and uncontrolled. But yeah, it's.
I also think that people that really knew. So I would agree with that. Thank you. I would also like to think that the people that were like most knowledgeable and most crucial for some of these designing of these programs like weren't available anymore. So for example, having Marie Sidman's involvement in any sort of design of a BACB task list would have been fucking amazing to have, right? Because at the end of his career, where like that's not what his focus was and his efforts weren't there, and he also just wasn't stable enough at the end of his life to be able to provide that sort of assistance. So it's almost like the people at the SQABs or wherever, right? Like that community just wasn't in position for whatever reason. I don't want to blame them, but also like I feel like it was the lack of like the division in these different areas of our field that led to practitioners not getting all of the information that they should have gotten. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the end result being you have to search it out.
Yeah,
yourself
for sure. I
really,
mean, it's just.
I mean, there's some mentors and other programs and stuff out there, but like,
and that's what we're trying to do with the podcast. That's what we're trying to do with the podcast, though, right? We're trying to offer. Hopefully, like you don't take this podcast as a terminal point. Please look at this as the beginning of a journey if you're interested in these ideas and these questions, because I think they really do illuminate, should inform certain perspectives. Because there's too much. Everybody's got an opinion, and that's totally fine. This is America, but I mean, like, make sure your opinion's informed. That's all I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the boys found that what they learned permitted them to deal more effectively with their gradually enlarging world. And for them, learning itself became reinforcing.
Whoa.
At first,
learning
the boys
is fun,
played the
the
tokens
mental.
for candy, and the system caught on quickly.
Yeah.
We were soon able to install a store where they could trade their tokens for many other items, toys, self-care items, clothing, coloring books, and so on. Later, our pupils became able to appreciate and to purchase desirable activities: roller skating, going for a walk, using a tricycle, listening to a record or tape, games, books, trips, the company of particular people, and for more advanced boys, private time and private space. Roller skates proved to be particularly effective toys. They were old-fashioned plastic four-wheeled skates that could be used both indoors and outdoors. We first taught the boys to walk on the skates while we held their outstretched hands. The next step was to require them to move a few inches without support until they reached and grasped our outstretched hands. And gradually we lengthened the distance they had to come to reach us. Keith originally tended to move in a fashion that can best be described as sloppy and floppy. When he first put on roller skates, it became evident that he had been paying no attention to the positions of his feet and legs. Within 5 minutes after he had put on the skates, he was giving close regard to his feet, putting them down very carefully, only a few inches from each other whenever he moved. This carefulness seemed to carry over to his normal walking and greatly improved his general appearance. In the first 4 months of the project, the boys made considerable progress in our original program of self-care activities. Although a sensitive visitor to the building was still likely to be depressed at what he saw, most of our boys were usually dressed. Only rarely did one find urine or feces on the floor. Several had learned to make beds and to help the attendants with this chore. Most of the boys now fed themselves, carried their empty dishes to the kitchen, and were considerably more orderly during meal times. Several had been taught to take complete care of the dining room with only minimal supervision, serving food, clearing and cleaning tables, and setting out dishes and utensils for the next meal. They received tokens for all these activities. We can turn the projector off for a few minutes. Okay. Kathy and I have done this before. We have to do a nice song and dance together here. Modern textbooks and courses list all the practices that I've noted: identifying existing behavior, finding reinforcers, and developing conditioned and generalized reinforcers. Unfortunately, reading books and listening to lectures set no contingencies on the behavior of readers and listeners. Missing is a particular kind of experience, along with its accompanying reinforcement. Such experience is tellingly illustrated by an excerpt from Harry Mackay's report of his initiation of our token system.
I want to jump in here because I think that what he just pointed out is the fundamental pressure that people encounter in our world today, and that is that money talks, bullshit walks, and ultimately all people really want from us anymore is to keep people happy. And if learning happens, cool, but really as long as problem behavior is suppressed, better. And what that does is leads to a stagnated outcome, stagnated life, and a very basic bitch existence from a practitioner perspective, where you don't get to contact the sensational feeling of successful intervention as an actual like experimental intervention in an applied setting. I can even speak from my own experience here and say that, like, you know, I came up through the ranks working, you know, I came into this work as a fucking, being a car salesman, and before that working in a factory. So, I mean, like, my understanding of the science was zero at the time. And I came in through this very procedural RBT-like, what would be today considered an RBT-like trajectory. And I became very competent in those procedures, and I was also taught to conceptualize behavior through the context of those very basic 3-term procedures, discrete trial-oriented type mindset. And what it was lacking and what it was missing was the idea that we are supposed to be playing with this stuff a little bit. And in order for us to be able to do that, we have to look at our work and our world as the sandbox that it is, and not be restricted by some of these institutional rules, which is what you brought up, Ryan, which is, I think we've encountered that a lot. I think now we have field specific type level institutional rules where there's things that we just don't do anymore. We don't do that. Not because you can't or you shouldn't or there's no place for it, but just because you don't do that. And so that way it has actually the opposite. Rather than not even contacting, being extinguished and not contacting reinforcement contingencies for it, like you're even coercively controlled and socially stigmatized if you even go out and reach out and try to touch that third rail sometimes. So that I can see how a lot of people are going to hear this and say like, well, I use tokens. I do this. I do that. What are you talking about? This guy's not doing anything special that we're not talking about. No, you're not. Like, maybe you do, maybe you don't. I'm not going to say that you don't, but I'm going to say this. It's incredibly unlikely that you're engaging in a stimulus pairing process. It's actually producing a generalized reinforcer in such a way as that you could write out your procedure, have a moron try it out, and then predictably test to see whether or not that thing is effective. And it'd be very unlikely that in an applied setting, I would walk in and you'd be able to actually describe that to me and then go and execute it yourself. Now, that's not saying that I'm perfect here either, that I could necessarily do that, which actually I think I could, but as I said, what I do actually. But I mean, the point is that, like, think about that as we're going through this, because that's the encouragement that we want to give our audience, or at least I want to give people, is that take the words of this great man who's saying, like, don't be suppressed by the pressure to keep people happy. Because that's really what it is. I think in clinics in particular, there's so much pressure to keep families happy because you don't want to lose business. There's competition out there, right? Mm-hmm. But I mean, like, the lack of field solidarity and understanding of the science permits people to deviate in such a way where where a lot of places or people provide these niche practices where it's like a lot more case management and a lot less behavior analysis. Okay. And that produces spotty results at best. And in my opinion, creates low quality, like, quality of life in work and in living and in contribution. I mean, I don't know. You don't take the vow of poverty that comes with doing this kind of work unless for some reason you're in it to change the world, or at least you're in it to, like, help somebody. And like this, and you contact the reinforcement, the satisfaction of doing that. And I think, in my personal opinion, I didn't really know what feeling I was chasing until I did, and I learned, and I executed on my first very real systematic use of intervention in this very clean, scientific way, to be able to identify and tack the distinction. But there's a great distinction between those two things, and I just want everyone to encourage to think about these things as we're going through this as a self-reflective process. Are you yielding to the principle? Are you yielding to outside influences? Are you compromising things and not really, and as a result being extinguished and kind of like not being as effective as you could be?
I'll identify the participants in our conferences by their initials and the boys by their first names. And here's what Harry reported. I'm sorry, for those of you who know him, I can't imitate his Scottish accent. HM said, I went in and sat on a table beside one of the attendants. Very quickly, there were 10 or 15 boys grouped around us. After handing out only a few candies, I started to use tokens. What I did was simply to put tokens into the hands of 3 or 4 of the brighter boys, take them back quite quickly initially, and at the same time put a candy into the other hand. In a short time, I was able to hand out 5 or 6 tokens to the boys nearest to me, and then take back the tokens and hand out the candies to these boys in turn. Then the attendant suggested it might be a good idea if he took the tokens down to one end of the room while I went to the other end with the candies. When we did this, most of the boys who had been grouped around the attendant and myself followed me. I had the candies, and they knew it.
Distance
Only 1 or
and
2
persistence.
went with the attendant, who had the poker chips. But very quickly, we had a steady stream of the boys running back and forth between this attendant and myself, picking up poker chips, returning them for candies, and going back through the cycle again. Then we switched, with me handing out tokens and the attendant handing out candy in exchange. For a time, I wandered about the room handing out tokens with a fairly large following of the boys. In the midst of the session, Dennis, a boy with deformed and useless legs, who had been sitting on a bench, crawled over and made quite obvious attempts to get my attention so that he could be given a token. He was told to go to the attendant and get his candy, and very soon he was back again. The behavior appeared to be well established. Toward the end of the session, I got 2 cups and 2 or 3 of the boys. I put the token under one of the cups and asked them to point to which of the cups had the token under it. Bobby and one other were also quite successful when the cups were switched around a little before they got the opportunity to point to the one that had the token under it. At this point, Dennis crawled over. I started merely to hand him a token. He made it quite clear, however, that this was not what he wanted. He pointed to the cups quite emphatically and was very happy when I put the token under one of the cups and let him pick the cup up to get the token. Well, it's important that practitioners experience incidents like this. Academic instruction is not enough. It's important that basic scientists experience incidents like this. They will never see them in the laboratory.
This is exactly what we've talked about in the past, where it almost seems like our field has not been designed for the right experiences to kind of create a tighter, closer community and understanding of all the different areas, branches, how they work together, what they're doing, so that we could all just move forward a little bit better, man. I keep going back to like physical therapy, medical sort of model of going to have to do your rotations and go get your experience in different places. You have to go into different settings to get a taste of them. And that is not design and behavior analysis, man. And I was super fortunate and lucky to have a lot of opportunities because of the mentors around me really pushing me, encouraging me. I busted my ass. They helped open doors, etc. But that's just not everybody's experience, dude. And we don't program for these things that he's talking about.
I mean, we don't program for him though, because this has become, we created shorthand processes that skip this initial aha moment that pushes people to have the motivation to try as hard as it is. Because, dude, it's not easy to be a practitioner scientist. It's a lot easier to run your regular little ABA programmies. You know what I mean? And slap it out those little Tokabe systems, slap a DRO on it, you know, then going through the process. And I think this is highlighted by 2 things. First, I think that's where like the notion of social validity has emerged from this initial discussion. And I think it's been used and abused to basically as a leverage point for, I don't know, decision makers and people who matter in the field to push people to keep people happy and focus on that as the outcome. That if people are satisfied, you're doing your job, which is bullshit. Because people can be unsatisfied and you still did your fucking job. If not, that's when you did the best job for them. And then also, I want to emphasize the way that he's talking about what they were doing, and I think that's significantly different than the way I hear other people talk, and even in myself in the past, where we highlight all the outcomes. We highlight outcomes. What, you know? We made so many changes, and he's so much better now. They've improved, amazing, and oh my god, we changed these people's lives. But I mean, like, that shouldn't be the conversations we're having. That shouldn't be the way that we talk about it. It should be more like exactly what he's talking about, which is he's describing methods. You know, I engaged in a stimulus pairing exercise by conditioning a reinforcer, an unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned reinforcer, right? By putting it in someone's alternate hands and then pairing them over time in trials and then engaging in a fading procedure to transfer that control completely. So like he's describing what he's doing, not what happened as a result, not the outcome, not the what happened as a result. And that's such a big piece of it. We should think a lot more systematically and a lot more procedurally in this way.
On that first day, 15 to 20 boys showed complete understanding of the tokens. 4 months later, at least 80% of the boys were accepting token reinforcers. A great problem, as might have been expected, was to teach the boys to save tokens and use them later. We had to work individually with many of the boys to teach them to do this. We started by giving them a candy for each token immediately after they earned it. and gradually increased the time they had to hold on to a token before they could trade it in. With some, we had to increase this delay period by only seconds at a time. Our laboratory
Better call Hanley again.
experience had alerted us to such necessary details.
They worked fast, dude.
It's not enough just to give tokens and ask pupils to save them. Training in token exchange and token saving will often require exquisitely detailed procedural modifications. As we increase the time a pupil must hold on to tokens before exchanging them, or as we increase the number of tokens that must be saved, the pupil will tell us if we're moving too fast. The tokens will lose their value.
Rad is always right,
and his
folks.
behavior will deteriorate. Like a basic researcher working with reinforcement schedules, a teacher must learn to recognize the signals, recover the behavior by going back to an earlier step, and reprogram the delay or the number of tokens that are required for exchange.
Dimitri, pause it. So you just talked about a couple things, but first, he said if it's not working, you take a step back. This is the basic shaping process. So many times, I got caught in this myself, but so many times when I was working in a clinical setting and trying to teach people, that realization that they had to take a step back and go to somewhere where they were previously before they could move forward again caused us so many troubles. Because it's like, I don't want to reinforce previous steps. Or we were all, it's just like, this is the shaping process. Like you're almost continually going backward, forward towards your goal. And dude, just the rule-governed coherence towards, no, we don't take steps back or things like that would cause so many troubles, dude. So many troubles. That's probably one of the biggest skill sets that I was so fortunate and lucky to learn, not only applied practice, but like working in a little bit more an experimental setting, working with fish in the fish lab, was realizing that you had to take steps back because something messed up for whatever it was. Like maybe it was your own doing, maybe it was something in the environment, some coincidental thing, whatever it was. But you had to be ready to take steps back, and you had to be very agile. And that was the other part here is they're going so fast in these, right? And so what I meant by agile is like you might take your step back 100 times in a day and forward, right? Like if you're one of those places where you're like, I'm going to change the schedule of reinforcement after I observed, and I'm going to go teach everybody about the new schedule of reinforcement next week, and it's going to take me a week to change what the schedule of reinforcement is for this client's program. Like you've missed it. You are not agile enough. You're not moving fast enough. Like you have to take a step back and train this in a totally different way. And that's teaching your clinicians or your registered behavior technicians, whoever it is, and your frontline staff, et cetera, whatever your term is, on how to actually apply these technologies, right? I think, and this was so clear to them, and it's not nearly as clear as it could be.
Well, I mean, you're describing what comes with fluency, though, man, and that's like you're talking about the flexibility and fluidity as a result of being fluent in the basic principles that we're talking about. And this
fluent in shaping is kind of what started me on this. Yeah,
I mean that's what it is, right? So what agility is the key term in terms of clinical practice, in my opinion. Okay, like there's this Bruce Lee quote, be like water, and that is literally, I mean, in terms of being a practitioner scientist, in my opinion, that is a big piece of it, in that you need to adapt to the environmental conditions that you have available to you, and with all their confoundingness, in order to be successful. And whenever you're trying to bend a contingency to your will, or you're going to follow through no matter what, or you're going to not do this one thing because, God damn it, this is going to get reinforced, or whatever stupid ass like thing you have going on through your head, like that's where you're being counterproductive, and you're not necessarily seeing the forest for the trees. And that's where a lot of the dogmatism comes into play, right? So like a lot of the things you're describing are a lot of the dogmatism that we encounter.
Effective teachers, therefore, have to be able to do more than recite basic principles. Principles do not give us procedures written in stone.
Yes.
The advantage of knowing the behavioral principles is that we can then knowledgeably modify procedures to fit an individual.
God.
We must remain attuned to the pupil's messages and be ready to try modifications and to evaluate them.
Wow.
Teaching, then, is not just a matter of changing the behavior of pupils. It's an interactive, social process. To teach effectively, the behavior of the teacher must also be modifiable in accord with contingencies that the pupil's behavior set.
Dude, what an amazing point, right? Teaching is a bidirectional process. You learn as much as you teach. And that's the thing, is that everything is data and should be affecting your behavior in response to that. But ultimately, you're responsible for controlling contingencies, not just to change behavior in and of itself, which is what a behavior reduction mindset does to people. And that's what we need to, what he's describing is focusing on skill acquisition, which is not what most people do in the field. Most people work in a behavior reduction role in the field that we operate on. They teach skills because they have to, and because it's like part of the thing, but not, I would argue on the applied side, most people are not experts at skill building, but they would call themselves experts at eliminating behavior. Well, the thing is, when you're eliminating behavior, like you're teaching someone to be a dead person, right? You're teaching to a null response. So understanding that the relationship that you have to them is educational.
Or you're just teaching that one replacement and you're not actually expanding their skill set beyond that.
Well,
right?
I mean, that's assuming that there is a replacement being targeted, which is not always the case because, again, what's the most common differential reinforcement strategy used in the field? O.
Zero.
O. Well, O means nothing. O means whatever, as long as it's not the bad thing. So, yeah.
It's up. As Skinner pointed out, experimentation, too, is a social process, an interaction during which subject and experimenter each influences the behavior of the other. A technique that we've discovered was quite effective for teaching actions that required several steps was chaining, particularly the procedure that has come to be known as backward chaining, or simply back chaining. How did we know about chaining and back chaining? These were, and still are, standard laboratory procedures for establishing behavioral baselines. Our basic science had prepared us. The following interchange took place between me and one of our less experienced staff. MP said, "Yesterday I worked mainly with Paul. I drew lines and Paul copied them quite nicely. I then went on to squares, but he wasn't completing them. He'd get sort of partially around, and then he'd start going on circle shapes again. So I decided to do all but one side of the square and let him fill that in. And that he did quite well. First, I left out the corner. Then I left out the whole side. I was going to go on and fade out the whole square until he was drawing the whole thing by himself. But at that point, he sort of decided he didn't want to play squares anymore." MS. Well, that would have been a good way to do it. Were you giving him tokens? MP. I gave him a token every time he filled in the part of the square that I left blank. MS. Well, when did you cash in the tokens? MP. I didn't cash them in. MS. Do you think that possibly his not wanting to play squares anymore had anything to do with the tokens not paying off? MP. Well, it might be, because I wasn't cashing them in at the time he was getting them. MS. Well, possibly you didn't have to cash in each one. When he has 2 or 3 tokens, cash them in, and you'll find that probably he'll stay longer. The tokens are not rewarding by themselves. They have to lead to something. Now, Paul copied very nicely. Why don't you go on and have him copy other things? MP. Well, I was doubtful that I could get him to copy anything difficult. MS. Well, you don't have to start with something difficult. He copied nicely when you built up the square gradually. Do the same thing with the letters of the alphabet, or even his name. MP. What would you suggest? Do the same kind of thing? Put down the whole name and just leave out a tiny bit? MS. Right. Put down the whole name. What's the last thing Paul has to do in writing his name? MP. Well, he has to put the tail on the L. MS. Okay. Put down the whole name except for the tail and let him finish it. Work backwards. Even before that, you want to make sure that he can recognize different letters. You might first get him to pick the letters of his name from all the others. Get him to recognize those particular letters before you teach him to draw them. Then Get him to recognize his name and what it means, so that when he finishes, it will be rewarding to him. If all you do is have him finish something he doesn't recognize as meaningful, then you may not be completing a chain at all. It may just be a series of unrelated movements and stimuli.
Oh my God. This is like a couple things. Number one is, I think it's a beautiful thing that he's describing some of these very basic things that we take for granted in the field and really outlining them in such a detailed way. Number two, notice the emphasis is on meaningfulness. Okay, acting with intention. That is the missing. If anyone wants to know what the secret sauce is to effective intervention, it's the intention to act towards a meaningful outcome, not just an outcome in and of itself. And that's really what I was trying to get at before when we were talking. When I interrupted before, is that the intention has to be set that it's not just about getting a rote response. It's not just getting someone to perform dog and pony tricks. Okay, it's teaching them how to effectively interact and engage in the world around them, so as they can change fundamentally their relationship to it for the rest of their lives in a quality kind of way. And that's real impact. And the only way that you can do that is by creating contingencies that feed to the meaningfulness of a thing, not just for the performance of the skill itself. So like understanding that we should factor in a contingency, you should factor in what does the end game really look like and really shape to that. Because oftentimes we stop once we've taught the skill in and of itself, but we haven't really built that meaningfulness that matters significantly.
The technique is essentially the same thing you did with the square, except that with a word, you may have to go back a little further to get him first to recognize it. Finally, as you build the chain backwards, the pupil may start to make mistakes. You have to be prepared to make changes, backing up, reteaching elements, and making sure the reinforcers are still effective. Here's another interaction along the same lines. DT said, I tried to teach Stevie to print his name. I started by having him copy, since he seemed able to do this. I pointed out his name and then drew a line farther down on the page and told him to copy it. Then I wrote the whole alphabet on a piece of paper and asked him to find an S, first showing him which was the S in his name. By rewarding him with tokens and encouragement, I was able to get him to pick out the S, T, I, and E. MS. Well, that's obviously a prerequisite for what you want. The boys have to be able to tell one letter from the other before you can expect them to write them. DT. Well, after he'd copied his name, Stevie, I turned the paper over and said, draw me an S. He was able to do this. I asked him to draw the next letter, and he drew an E. He drew these two letters from memory, but got hung up. MS. So you ran up against a roadblock. What might you do to get over it? The problem was to get him to write the letters of his name in the correct sequence, from memory. DT. I told him he'd left out a letter. MS. Well, that was a pretty big jump. DT. Well, we want him to write his name from memory. MS. S, T, E, V, I, E. DT. Oh, we should first have him copy all the letters of his name. Well, he can already do this. Then we should give him S, T, E, V, I and tell him to finish it. MS. Very good. Start at the end of the chain. Give him the first 5 letters and ask him to supply the final E. Then give him the first 4 letters. Have him supply the final IE. Work backwards. I should point out that each line here on this transparency, each trial actually appeared on a separate card. Again, with a relatively inexperienced staff member, I said, suppose you want to teach a boy to put his shirt on. How would you go about that? SR answered, I'd first encourage him to put one arm in, and I would then put the rest of his shirt on and give him a candy. MS. In working with the boys and writing their names, several of us have been using a technique that's been quite successful. For example, first you have Stevie copy his whole name, then you give him all but the last letter and let him print the E, finishing the name right away. Then work backwards, having him put in the IE and then the VIE, and so on. This is a generalizable procedure. You have a long chain of behavior to teach. If you start at the beginning of that chain, it's going to be a long time before the pupil is rewarded by completing the task. It's a much harder job that way. SR. Then you would put the shirt on the boy and first have him simply pull it down. MS. That's right. SR. And then you could put in one arm and let him put in the other and pull the shirt down. MS. You have to analyze the motions that actually go into the activity and then work backwards. And this critical feature of backchaining is often overlooked. Because while learning earlier links in a chain, pupils can always complete the subsequent links successfully because they've already learned them. And therefore, reinforcement on each trial is inevitable. The technique is important if the completion of the behavior is itself rewarding to the pupil. You can teach boys to tie their shoes that way, if they want to tie their shoes. But if they're not interested in the final product for its own sake, you have to depend on the tokens rather than the completion of the activity. Then I don't think it'll matter whether you work from the beginning or the end. What else can we do to make the completion of dressing reinforcing? Other things besides giving tokens. SR. Well, we might bring in some different types of candy. MS. What would be relevant to being fully dressed? SR. Well, going out. MS. Going out for a walk. They can't go unless they're dressed. Or let the boys join some of the more desirable activities as soon as they have finished dressing themselves. The dressing is important. It has an effect on all of us who are working with the boys. It changes our attitude toward them and generally makes us all more effective with them. And a diary entry by Mrs. Cassidy illustrates her backchaining method for teaching the most severely retarded boys to feed themselves. BC wrote, I've started to teach Michael to feed himself. When he first came to us, he was 7 years old and still drinking from a bottle. He looked more like 2. He is now about 10 and looks about 4 or 5. At meal times, he usually screams until someone starts to feed him. First, I tried to get him to hold a spoon while I fed him. I would not give him a spoonful of food unless he held his spoon in his hand. After about 3 tries, he finally held the spoon. Quickly, I put food in his mouth. He dropped the spoon. I put it back in his hand again. Finally, he held the spoon for 3 spoonsfuls. I then put my hand over his hand and filled his spoon with food and guided it into his mouth. After about 4 tries at this, I let go of the spoon just outside his mouth, and he put the spoon the rest of the way in. At the end of the meal, he would finish bringing the food up to his mouth from about 3 inches away and would then drop the spoon into the bowl. I would then place my hand over his hand, fill the spoon, and start guiding it up to his mouth, letting go a little further away each time. A week later, she wrote, Michael managed to eat by himself today. He still has difficulty getting a full spoon, but he's learning. He still has to have the spoon placed in his hand, and he still requires the person who's feeding him to be where he can see them. If not, he gets up from the table and wanders off. But this is only natural, because all his life, when the adult left, the meal was over. Mrs. Cassidy, who was in charge of the building.
I want to highlight the fact that he's really not talking about, like, he's not being preachy. You know what I mean? He's just going through his own experience and outlining things that he's done that, you know, any person who does what we do is like, this shit is whatever. Like, who doesn't do this? You know? And I think what's important is that, like, number one, to appreciate how revolutionary at the time it was. And number two, that there's an elegance in simplicity and in executing that simple thing to perfection. And what I'm hearing is him describe that process. I also think that maybe secretly he wanted to be an author of, like, fiction, and apparently he didn't, because he's really going into this narrative really hard too. But anyway, just some things to think about there.
Had never heard of behavior analysis. nor had anybody instructed her about this way to teach self-feeding, or about any of the other new programs she instituted herself. This is what can happen when an intelligent, motivated worker has the opportunity to observe behavior analysis being applied. And seeing this kind of learning take place is a reinforcer that scientists who confine themselves to their laboratories are missing. Also, more of this kind of interaction will be needed if society is to recognize the value of behavior analytic science.
See, that's the big takeaway, though, right? I think the number one question, if you look at like clinic directors or like just people in the biz, we talk about people in the biz. I can't believe I just said that. Shame on me. Shame on me. What the fuck? What a disgusting turn of phrase. Unacceptable. I'm smacking my own hand right now. Is that, you know, the question of how to motivate direct care staff is a serious thing. I mean, we're going through a shortage in the field right now of direct care line staff, and their options are open and they can jump ship and go wherever they want. They can take the training that you gave them and use it somewhere else. And they do for another quarter an hour or whatever really nominal thing that they were able to negotiate. And that leaves you kind of holding the bag. And a lot of that has to do, in my opinion, in that we don't inspire people really outside of teaching them things and putting out expectations on that, and understanding that the inspiration comes from contacting really amazing, really good intervention. And that if you don't have that, if it's not being contacted, if it's not there, you really lose that little piece, that little motivating piece that matters significantly.
That's something we always worked on, man, at the organizations I was at, is kind of thinking about how do you create your funnels of people coming in, right, from different backgrounds, different interest areas. And then how do you start providing opportunities for them to learn and express like what they are learning as a result of that. So just little things like having these feedback check-in sessions for 5 or 10 minutes a week with your staff would allow us to kind of get a sense of what they're interested in, how we can maybe, keep nurturing and reinforcing and working on those sort of things. I think it requires so much focus and time and effort on that it's hard to sometimes justify putting your time there up front, but damn, does it reward, man.
Well, and that's, and that's the thing. I think that it's because that's the slow process of culture building, right? And that's what we're not really in the business of. I think that, again, this is where focusing on all these positive interventions has gotten us into this world where we just think that a tangible or some type of positive intervention is going to necessarily produce that's immediate. And it's not about that. It's like giving people transferable skills and then teaching them how to contact the actual physical improvement that you see from a person. It creates a level of satisfaction that you only really understand if you've done the work. And if you have done the work and you know the feeling that I'm talking about, that should be the feeling that you're trying to condition, right? That's the reinforcer. That's the thing that you're trying to leverage to keep people involved and motivated to do this. Because again, you don't take a vow of poverty for any fucking other reason other than you give a shit a little bit somewhere, no matter how cynical you are. And in order to accomplish that goal, you're constantly in search of that response, that emotional experience. And that means that you can tact it. That means you can identify what it is experientially. And that means that you should be able to know how to create the conditions that produce it. Mm-hmm. And that's the biggest thing. And making sure that we're not defaulting to some of these dumb. That's why I get so ornery about OBM, but I digress. Anyway, next.
Another thing we learned quickly, perhaps because we had already learned it in the laboratory, was that we were not always teaching what we thought we were teaching. An informal experiment by Barbara Ray brought home a simple but most important lesson. In brief, that lesson is that it's easy to deceive ourselves into the belief that we have taught pupils one thing when actually they have learned something else. Here's an excerpt from her report. BR said, I wanted to follow up the suggestion that we had to teach the boys first to listen to sounds before we could teach them to say the sounds, and to develop a method for teaching them the necessary auditory discriminations. I started working with the letter A. I wanted the boys to run across the room and then come to me for a token whenever they heard the sound of A. I started by just telling a boy to walk over to the corner, pointing and giving him every bit of help I could to make him understand. When he got there, I told him to come to me, and I gave him a token. In this way, I established the pattern of having the boys going across the room to the corner and then coming over to me, getting their token, and sitting down. Then I said, "Now, when I say A, go over there." I started out saying a lot of letters of the alphabet that were not A, to see if they would go. None of them went to the corner on any letter, including A. Then I started giving them extra cues. When I started saying the letter A, I would also point, raise my voice, and continue to repeat the letter A. So I was giving them at least 4 different cues: the letter, the pointing, raising my voice, and the repetition. I decided to see what was getting Dennis, Richard, and Kent to go across the room. They were always doing it. Whatever I was doing was getting them to go across the room, but I didn't really know which of the cues they were using. The first thing I did was to cover my mouth when I started saying the letters. When I started with a long string of letters, emphasizing the A, they all sat in their chairs. So it wasn't the raised voice. When I said the letter A without raising my voice, they just sat there. So it wasn't the letter. I then kept repeating the letter A. They did not use the repetitive cue either. Then I found out what they were using. Both Richard and Kent were definitely using the motion of my hand. I even said, "Go ahead," to Richard, and he didn't move. He was watching a pencil with which I was making slight pointing movements. His eyes were glued to the pencil as I went through the letters. Kent also was using a visual cue, a gesture of my hand. They would both go whenever I gestured, but not when I said the letter A, when I raised my voice, or when I repeated the letter. Their behavior was completely under visual control, not auditory, and that's pretty bad. To detect such instances, practitioners and researchers have to be skeptical about their seeming successes. We learned quickly to question our first impressions when it looked as though one of our boys had learned what we were trying to teach him. In the laboratory, we had found it necessary always to question the obvious. In our new practitioners' roles, we found that same skepticism to be warranted. The properly skeptical teacher or other practitioner will always ask, was the pupil's new behavior the result of what I think I did? He or she will even ask, did I really do what I think I did? In asking and answering these questions, practitioners become effective scientists, and scientists become effective practitioners. As is well known, it's often difficult to get pupils to generalize what they have learned in the classroom for use outside. Working with the boys in this project made the road to generality quite obvious to us eventually. For example, it became clear that when we taught them to recognize or to say words, they were learning something that had no significance for them outside the teaching situation. Even before trying to build up a vocabulary, we had to get across the notion to the boys that speech has a function, that they can say something and have something happen in the world as a result of what they say. When a particular kind of action comes to serve many different functions, that is to say, when it leads to many different reinforcers, you will see that behavior again in all situations in which it leads to some reinforcer. For example, after we required the boys to be fully clothed before they could participate in any reinforcing activity, remaining dressed turned quickly into a generalized reinforcer. It made all other reinforcers available, including all the opportunities to earn tokens. We turn the tokens into generalized reinforcers by consistently requiring the boys to use them to purchase all other reinforcers. That then is the key to generality. Behavior will appear in new situations to the extent that it leads to occasions for reinforcement. The more reinforcers or occasions for reinforcement that some particular conduct makes available, the more that conduct will generalize. Once, an unplanned demonstration of generality took place.
You know, I love watching this old stuff because their choice of words is so interesting. Like, he used the word conduct. Like, if we were to use that word today, I feel like you'd get a little bit of a side eye.
Yeah.
Right? But I mean, like, but he means it in the loaded way that he means it. And that, like, there's more to behaving or acting out against one's environment than just the act in and of itself intrinsically in a vacuum. It exists within a contextual reality. And that interpretation of it, and then the intentional act of doing it in real time matters in relation to that context. And like, thinking about it that way and understanding that it has ramifications if you don't do a certain thing or you do a particular thing matters. Because I think, I heard someone recently, I heard someone recently say, these kids there's no consequences here. Now, on the one hand, like, my really nitpicky brain wants to be like, well, technically, no consequence is a consequence, but okay. But aside that, though, what they really mean is that there's no clear expectation for conduct, and there's no necessary alternative contingency that they're going to conduct as a result of that. Like, as if it's appropriate or acceptable for the aberrant behavior to occurring while you're teaching the other thing in general, and like not having a tolerance for that, I think is an interesting perspective that can go the wrong way if you get too ridiculous with it. But having that in the back of your mind matters. And that goes back to the raising the standards thing, I think.
The piece on generality is interesting too. I feel like he's always thinking ahead as much as he can. And this is something that I was taught through just kind of a lucky early supervisor and mentor, was that idea of like, we're not just here to help right now, but like, we need to figure out where this is going to go. So I had a supervisor that would not allow me to put anything into place without explaining how it was going to be faded out. So there was nothing, absolutely no changes were allowed to be made programmatically until you were able to explain conceptually how you would fade that sort of thing out. So
I bet also knowing where it's going to go too, though.
What?
I bet also being able to articulate what this skill should lead to and where it's going ultimately as well too. Yeah,
and it was teaching someone how to play chess, right? At the end of the day, of if you're going to use this token board in the moment, how do you get rid of that token board? And you're like, well, I don't know. Like, that's something I don't need. And it's like, no, that's something that you need to have sorted out right now and planned in and know conceptually and like when you're going to make those steps, but conceptually when you're going to and how you're going to do those sort of things too. So like generality, I'm guessing generality for him was like not hard necessarily, It reminds me of Israel Golddiamond's work with, what was it? Stuttering. I believe they ran 34 participants. 33 out of 34 were no longer stuttering after intervention. And he goes, what were your procedures on that 34th? Looks at him, investigates. He's like, oh yeah, you messed this up. Clean that up. 34th participant, essentially treat it. it was 34 out of 34 that were in that article with the data that was presented. And this wasn't some, fantastic article piece that he just like published for sake of publishing. No, he figured out how to procedurally achieve that outcome every single time because they took so much care and made sure that they were kind of connecting all the dots, from analysis to out the door, effective. People are now happy, stoked, and on their way, right?
To those who speak the Hanley My Way protocol language or whatever, FCT, denial, delay, tolerance language, I mean, that's what is this? This is contextually appropriate behaviors. This is timing, behavioral timing. This is conditioning reinforcers and or leveraging reinforcers, and also teaching meaningful human interaction. I think that we really miss the point of that. And a lot of the times people mask their lack of connection to it by being cutesy. And then if you're not cutesy, you're not necessarily being like human like. But that to me is disingenuous and not actually real. That does not produce good human interaction. Real human interaction is contingent. You want my attention, you need to be able to behave and or engage me in a particular way to get my attention, and I need to engage in a particular way to engage your attention. And that's a two-way street. All relationships should be that way. And non-contingently, that produces bizarre results, which is what we're seeing and getting. And he's describing a bi-directional relationship, which is like absolutely critical. Know where you're going. Now that's a dogmatic rule you should incorporate into your ethos and reality.
One day, all the tokens in the building disappeared, except those in the possession of the boys themselves, of course. Later in the day, we received a call from a worker in another building, which Jackie visited every day to take part in some research.
Someone else jacked the
This
tokens.
worker was a young lady of whom Jackie had become quite fond. Right? She had told Jackie that she was saving her money to buy an automobile, and Jackie had asked her how many tokens an automobile would cost. She had replied casually, "Oh, it would take 1,000,000 tokens." Well, the young lady reported that Jackie had brought her a bag filled with hundreds of tokens. In our initial efforts with speech and articulation, all of us made a concerted effort to observe the boys' verbal behavior and to include it in the token program. We gave them tokens for speaking instead of using gestures, for pronouncing more carefully, for saying please and thank you, and for stringing words into longer phrases and sentences. As a consequence of these efforts, the total output of verbal behavior from the boys increased remarkably. After 4 months, when people whom the boys knew came into the building, they immediately heard about everything that had happened during their absence. The task then became not only to increase the boys' verbal communication, but to channel their verbal activity into useful and constructive areas. The following excerpts from a conference illustrate some of what we were learning. CP said, "I had the boys from the pronunciation and vocabulary building group. I used the flashcards. I showed them the pictures and asked them, what is this? When I got the word, for example, cake, I asked them what they did with the cake. MS. That was a good thing to do, to try to carry on a conversation about simple things. In that way, you build up their vocabulary, and at the same time, you teach them to use the words. Even more directly, it would be good if you could teach them to use the words in such a way that there's some immediate consequence besides the tokens. Like pencil. You can do something with a pencil that has an effect on the environment. It makes marks. With crayons, they can make colors. Cakes can be eaten. Bring things like that into the teaching situation so that the boys can immediately get other effects from the environment besides the tokens. Eventually, the boys have to get their rewards from the communication process itself. We have to shift to that from the tokens. Bring in some candies and discuss the candy wrappers. What's on the candy wrappers, the color of the wrappers, and the color of the candy, and whether it's hard, soft, long and thin, or short and fat. And compare these to other objects that have similar kinds of properties.
That's what you said.
Perhaps even have the boys ask the questions and get them talking to each other. There's no point in just teaching them a long list of words. Mrs. Cassidy made the following note. At breakfast, Bertram was helping by giving out the bread and butter while I did the chocolate milk. I was making each boy ask for the milk by saying, "May I have chocolate milk?" They were not served unless they said as much of this as I felt each one was capable of. Bertram was making each one say please and thank you for bread. And each time one answered correctly, he would say, "That's right." Bert was a Down syndrome teenager, and he was quite on to our reinforcement system. Finally, he got to Leroy, who said please for his bread, but would not say thank you. Bertram would not let go of the bread. And I was frightened that Leroy would start an incident Leroy was a large, strong boy who was frequently destructive. So I went over and took the bread, letting Bertram continue to give bread to the other boys. Leroy finally said, "Thank you." At this, Bertram turned and said, "About time." I think we can turn the projector off. Thanks. I won't be using that last transparency. So there are some highlights of our project in its early stages. We never wrote this up as a research report, and we never will. Why not? Because so much was happening, all at the same time, that we could rarely attribute general changes to any particular procedure of ours. As the token system became effective, the boys learned about new kinds of reinforcers. They learned to save. They began to buy things from each other. Learning became reinforcing in its own right. Much learning took place through imitation. New personal relationships developed among the boys and between the boys and us. And as the new reinforcement system matured, it remained in operation whether we were there or not. These kinds of developments produced changes whose precise causes we could not pinpoint. What we had done was to create a community devoted to learning, to change. What we did affected the boys' behavior, and what the boys did affected our behavior. Everything that happened had an effect on everything else. We were all changing, all the time. Well, not the stuff that experimental science is made of, but valuable nonetheless. Although some of us knew the scientific principles quite well, we found out quickly that those principles did not give us a fixed set of procedures. Rather, they helped inform us what to do next when a particular procedure did not work, or when a particular problem arose. What would you do when Bobby acts as if he's having a convulsion? When Stevie leaves out some of the letters of his name, what would you do next? How would you deal with the stealing of tokens? When Paul copies straight lines and circles nicely but fails to copy squares, what might you try next? What does it suggest to you when Richard seems to copy vertical lines perfectly, but continues to draw a vertical line when you ask him to copy a horizontal line? How do you react when Leroy goes around breaking windows with his bare fist? What would you do to keep the boys dressed, even after they no longer receive tokens for remaining dressed? Well, such situations are too numerous and varied for them all to be dealt with in texts and lectures. Our discipline has become formalized. Training has become more a matter of learning rules than of experiencing contingencies. We place a growing emphasis on academic degrees and on oral and written qualifying exams. We certify individuals in training programs via written examinations, formal protocols, and personal testimonials. Well, now, there's nothing wrong with any of these. But we need workers who know not just how to talk and write about behavior analysis, but who know how to do behavior analysis. Education is the area in which Skinner's discussions of the differences between rule-governed and contingency-governed behavior become most pertinent. My hope is that our story will encourage behavior analysts to place more emphasis on actual experience with the basics in training others and themselves to solve applied problems. Also, to the extent that our scientists become practitioners and our practitioners become scientists, our basic and applied sciences will continue to nourish each other. Thank you very much.
That finish. It was anyone who was able to hang out with us. I understand like the in between 30 minutes ish was tough. If you got a little bored, I'm sorry. But that finish though, holy shit.
Rocks it, dude.
People need to be able to know how to do. Oh man, not just know.
Yep.
Oof. That is on.
This was 98. This was around the top when Florida certification, the BACB, things like that were going. I don't know, man. I feel like there was
22
enough
years
of
later.
a divide. There was enough of a divide, and not the right people were involved in creating these systems, dude.
Oh man, 22 years later. Wow.
The same shit applies.
Yeah.
Same problems have just continued to.
Shout
grow.
out Murray Sidman, man, for being epic. Passed on May 18th, 2019, just last year. Absolute legend. And also shout out to Matt Bell, previous guest of ours, who when we were talking about conditioned reinforcers before, he actually has a great chapter in this book, Operant and Classical Conditioning by the Wiley and Blackwell Handbook. That is killer for that kind of stuff. If people are interested.
Cool.
So what's your reaction to this, man? What's the final takeaway that you think? What's your final takeaway?
I mean, like, he's so great at describing and telling a story around like why people get into this field and how we could potentially continue to nourish and train people under the right circumstances to care.
Yeah.
And for me, that's why I got into it. That's why I'm still in it. And I really think that we messed up as a community of listening to words like this and building these sort of systems across the board. I've seen a handful of organizations that seem to do pretty damn well at achieving these sort of things, but the reason we get some kickback and negative press and things like that is because we weren't quite careful enough in listening to the forefathers and the foremothers and really bringing this sort of stuff in, right?
Yeah, I throughout while we were listening to the video, and I watched this video a long time ago, so actually it almost felt like the first time again. So I wrote down these things as he was talking. I'm calling them Murray's rules of getting good. And I'm going to go with number one, and just for a takeaway for the audience, raise your standards in your clinical practice, and that includes raising your standards for response expectation and performance expectation. Focus on motivation. Understand MOs, understand reinforcers, how to use them, how to manipulate them. Develop conditioned reinforcers, so build new ones. Be adaptive, responsive to the learner. Be like water, in the words of Bruce Lee. Number 5, evaluate your process / troubleshoot. Be a self-skeptic. Question yourself. Number 6, program for generalization. That should be a key component to what we're trying to accomplish at all times. Number 7, which this goes with that, know where you're going. Understand what the end game is. What's the vision for this skill? Where does it fit in the grand scheme of this person's life, and why does it matter? Number 8, create a community of learning. That was just, that is the key, I think, to success and happiness in the workplace, and that's also the key in success to sustainability long term in a world where gains are low and slow sometimes, and that's creating a community of learning around you. Number 9, contact contingencies. Don't be afraid to fail, basically, is what this means. Okay, this is the behavior analyst version of don't be afraid to fail. Contingencies teach us. Behavior is learned. Behavior is selected through consequences. And unless you're contacting those consequences, you're never going to get better. And number 10, avoid rules. And I absolutely, again, this is not to say avoid, matching law or like whatever. This is about avoiding these institutional rules, these dogmatic patterns that we fall in, these verbal rules that dictate our practice in a manner that is not necessarily functionally or contextually relevant. And
exactly.
Being aware of what that means and how it impacts your ability to do what you need to do for the person that you're charged to do, whatever you're doing them for them.
Yep, you gotta check those rules and make sure that they're actually based in reality of like the context, or sorry, the contingencies are actually operating in that environment, right?
So that's Murray's rules of getting good.
Those are beautiful.
And yeah, man, thank you for listening. If you hung out with us this whole time, hopefully we'll continue to do these. Sometimes they can get a little dry in the middle. We are talking about people talking, but we got a couple other ones in the wings here. We got one on Skinner with education, sit down interview from the 50s. That is savage.
Savage.
Yeah, Skinner, savage AF on the education, like in a way that will, that'll make the hair on your back of your neck stand up a little bit when we listen to that. I gotta talk about that. So, but that's all I really have to say about it. Any closing statements?
Marvelous.
Marvelous. Catch you later.